November 14th, 1891. The sun hadn't yet broken over the Mitchell grass downs of western Queensland when station hand Thomas Weatherby discovered something that would haunt him until his death 40 years later. 1,000 sheep lay broken at the bottom of Hangman's Gorge, their bodies forming a grotesque carpet of wool and blood stretching nearly a quarter mile. Standing at the precipice, utterly silent, was a red and tan kelpie named Banjo, the prized working dog of drover James Kirkwood. But James Kirkwood was nowhere to be found. What the authorities discovered 3 hours later in the equipment shed would force them to question everything they thought they knew about the bond between man and beast. The official record states that Kirkwood took his own life. The station workers whispered a different story, one about a dog that had learned to hate, and a master who had trained it too well. But the truth was far more terrifying than either version could capture. Before we uncover the truth about the sheep station kelpie and the blood-soaked morning that changed Queensland's droving industry forever, make sure to subscribe to the Fear Abbey and ring that notification bell. We dive deep into the darkest corners of history that textbooks won't touch. The real stories behind humanity's most disturbing mysteries. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers scattered across the globe. Now let's step back into 1891 Queensland, where the Australian frontier was about to witness something it had never seen before. The year 1891 marked a turning point in Australian colonial history. The great maritime and shearers' strikes had crippled the wool industry, pitting laborers against station owners in what would become one of the most bitter industrial conflicts in the nation's history. Queensland's pastoral districts existed in a state of barely controlled tension, with armed militia patrolling properties and union organizers disappearing into the outback without explanation. Thornfield Station occupied 180,000 acres of Mitchell grass country, approximately 40 miles southwest of what is now Longreach. Owner Edward Thornfield had inherited the property from his father in 1883 and ran it with the iron-fisted efficiency typical of wealthy squatters of that era. His station supported nearly 15,000 sheep, managed by a skeleton crew of 12 men who lived in crude bark huts near the main homestead. The country itself was harsh and unforgiving. Summer temperatures regularly exceeded 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Water was scarce, contained in a handful of bores and natural water holes that determined where sheep could graze. The landscape was vast and exposed, red earth stretching to horizons broken only by scattered coolabah trees and the occasional rocky outcrop. This was country that broke men's spirits as readily as their bodies. Into this world came James Kirkwood in March of 1888. At 32 years old, Kirkwood was already considered one of the finest drovers in Queensland. Station records describe him as taciturn but reliable, capable of moving large mobs across difficult country with minimal losses. He had worked for Thornfield for 3 years, earning the considerable sum of £2 per week, nearly double the wage of ordinary station hands. Kirkwood's reputation rested largely on his partnership with Banjo, a 3-year-old red kelpie he'd acquired as a pup from the legendary Gleeson Kennels near Casterton, Victoria. Contemporary accounts describe Banjo as exceptional even by the standards of working kelpies. Capable of controlling 500 sheep single-handedly, tireless in heat that would kill lesser dogs, and possessed of an almost supernatural ability to anticipate his master's commands. That dog could read Kirkwood's mind, recalled station hand William McAllister in a 1923 interview preserved in the Longreach Historical Society archives. I seen him send Banjo to bring in strays from 3 miles out without so much as a word. The dog would just look at him, and off he'd go, straight as an arrow to wherever them sheep had wandered. But those who worked closely with Kirkwood noted something else. A relationship that evolved beyond the typical bond between drover and dog into something more intense, more obsessive. Kirkwood spoke to Banjo constantly, carrying on what appeared to be conversations during long days in the paddocks. He slept with the dog in his hut, fed it from his own plate, and reacted with explosive violence to anyone who mistreated or even criticized the animal. In July of 1890, Kirkwood had broken stockman Peter Chen's jaw after Chen kicked Banjo for nipping at his horse's heels, a common enough occurrence that would normally warrant nothing more than a curse. Thornfield had nearly dismissed Kirkwood over the incident, but the drover was simply too valuable during the critical shearing season. Chen was paid £5 to keep quiet and transferred to another section of the station. The incident should have served as a warning. Instead, it was forgotten in the daily grind of station life, filed away as just another example of the eccentricity expected from men who spent too much time alone in the bush. By November of 1891, the political situation had deteriorated further. The shearers' strike had evolved into open conflict. 3 union organizers had been arrested in Barcaldine, and rumors circulated of strike-breaking workers being ambushed and beaten on isolated tracks. Thornfield had hired additional men specifically to guard the property, and tensions ran high between the established hands and these newcomers. Into this powder keg of industrial unrest and frontier violence, something else was stirring. Something that had been building in the twisted bond between James Kirkwood and his dog. Station cook Margaret O'Brien would later testify that in the weeks before November 14th, she'd noticed Kirkwood talking to Banjo with increasing urgency, as though explaining something of great importance. He'd sit there in the darkness outside the cookhouse, she told investigators, having these long, one-sided conversations with that dog. But the strangest thing was, sometimes it didn't seem one-sided at all. The way that KELPIE would tilt its head and stare at him, you'd swear it understood every word. The first incident occurred on October 3, 1891, during a routine muster of the station's northern paddock. Kirkwood had been assigned to move approximately 800 sheep to new grazing areas closer to the station's main bore. Standard procedure for a drover of his experience, a task he'd completed hundreds of times before without incident. He set out at dawn with Banjo and 2 younger station hands, Michael O'Grady and Samuel Finch, who were meant to assist with the gates and help prevent breakaways. What should have taken 4 hours stretched into 9. According to O'Grady's statement to Edward Thornfield, preserved in the station's ledger books, Kirkwood's behavior became increasingly erratic as the day progressed. Rather than moving the sheep directly to the designated paddock, he seemed to be driving them in elaborate patterns, forcing them to circle back on themselves, reversing direction without apparent reason. When O'Grady questioned the route, Kirkwood reportedly said, teaching him the geometry of it, he needs to understand the patterns. When pressed to clarify who he was, Kirkwood simply gestured to Banjo. More disturbing was what happened when a small group of sheep broke away from the mob. Normally, a working dog would chase down strays and return them to the main group using controlled pressure and strategic positioning. Instead, Banjo pursued the breakaways with what O'Grady described as terrible purpose, driving them at full speed directly toward a fence line. The sheep, panicked and disoriented, crashed into the barbed wire. 3 animals died immediately from their injuries. 2 more had to be destroyed later that evening. Kirkwood showed no reaction to the losses. He simply stood watching as Banjo returned to his side, the dog's muzzle flecked with blood and foam. "Good boy," Kirkwood murmured, loud enough for both younger men to hear. "You're learning the difference between herding and hunting." The incident cost Thornfield Station nearly 10 pounds in lost livestock. A significant sum, but not unusual enough to warrant serious investigation. O'Grady and Finch reported what they'd witnessed, but Thornfield attributed Kirkwood's odd behavior to the heat and the general stress affecting all his workers during the strike period. The drover received a warning. Nothing more. The second incident proved harder to dismiss. On October 19th, Station Overseer Robert Hennessy discovered the carcasses of 37 sheep in the dried bed of Cooper's Creek, approximately 2 miles from the main station buildings. The animals hadn't died from thirst or disease. They had been systematically driven into a narrow ravine and left there, packed so tightly together that many had suffocated or been trampled to death by their flockmates. The scene was grotesque. Sheep had climbed onto each other's backs in their panic, creating a pyramid of wool and flesh that reached nearly 6 feet high. Those at the bottom had been crushed, their bodies flattened into the cracked earth. The smell was overwhelming, death and lanolin and the sweet, sick scent of decay in the October heat. What made the discovery truly disturbing was the evidence of organization. The sheep hadn't simply wandered into the ravine. Someone, or something, had deliberately driven them there in stages, blocking the entrance after each group entered to prevent escape. Hennessy found clear dog prints in the dirt at both ends of the ravine, along with what appeared to be human boot prints matching the distinctive pattern of Kirkwood's leather droving boots. When confronted, Kirkwood denied any knowledge of the incident. He claimed to have spent the previous 3 days working the station's southern paddocks, a story corroborated by cook Margaret O'Brien, who reported serving him dinner at the usual time on each of those evenings. But several station hands noted that Kirkwood could easily have slipped away during the day, completed whatever dark work occupied him at the ravine, and returned before nightfall. Edward Thornfield conducted a formal inquiry. He questioned Kirkwood directly, asking if the drover had any explanation for why his boot prints would be found at the scene of such strange and costly destruction. Kirkwood's response, recorded in Thornfield's personal diary, was chilling in its deflection. "A man's boots walk where his feet take them. Perhaps you should be asking where my feet were, not where my prints ended up." The inquiry went nowhere. Without definitive proof that Kirkwood had deliberately killed the sheep, Thornfield could only dock his wages to cover the losses and assign him to work closer to the main station, where he could be more carefully supervised. But the supervision proved ineffective. Kirkwood continued his long conversations with Banjo, now often conducted in the open where other workers could observe them. Station hand William McAllister recalled one particularly unsettling exchange he'd witnessed in late October. Kirkwood was kneeling in the dirt, holding Banjo's head between his hands, staring into the dog's eyes like he was trying to see into its soul. He was whispering something over and over. I got close enough to hear it. You understand now, don't you? You understand what they are, what we are, the difference between us. The third incident occurred on November 7th, exactly 1 week before the main event that would make Thornfield Station infamous. The night watchman, a taciturn ex-convict named Arthur Graves, reported seeing Banjo alone in the darkness near the hold. In yards where approximately 200 sheep waited for shearing. This was unusual. Kirkwood never allowed his dog to wander unsupervised at night. Graves approached to investigate and witnessed something that would plague his dreams for the remainder of his life. Banjo was methodically working the sheep in the yard, not hurting them but organizing them. The dog would single out individual animals, nip at their legs to force them to move, and arrange them in precise rows and patterns. To Graves's trained eye, it looked like Banjo was sorting the flock according to some incomprehensible criteria, perhaps size or age or some quality only the dog could perceive. When Graves called out, Banjo stopped immediately and stared at the watchman with what Graves later described as human intelligence in an animal's eyes. The dog held his gaze for perhaps 10 seconds, an eternity in such circumstances, before turning and trotting back toward Kirkwood's hut without a backward glance. Graves reported the incident the following morning. Edward Thornfield, now genuinely concerned about his drover's mental state and the potential danger posed by an improperly supervised working dog, decided to confront Kirkwood directly and demand an explanation for these increasingly bizarre occurrences. The meeting took place on November 10th in Thornfield's office. No written record exists of what was discussed, but Margaret O'Brien, who was cleaning the adjacent room, overheard portions of the conversation. According to her testimony to the police magistrate in December 1891, Thornfield accused Kirkwood of conducting unnatural experiments with his dog and demanded to know what purpose lay behind the drover's strange behavior. Kirkwood's response was calm and measured. I'm teaching him to think beyond instinct, to understand that every action has meaning, that hurting is just controlled violence, and that he has the power to choose which form that violence takes. You asked what purpose lies behind it. The same purpose that lies behind everything men do with animals, Mr. Thornfield. Control, dominion, the satisfaction of bending another creature's will to match your own. Thornfield reportedly ordered Kirkwood off the property immediately, effective the following morning. The drover could collect his wages and his dog, and leave Thornfield Station permanently. Kirkwood accepted this dismissal without argument. He simply nodded, stood, and walked out of the office. Margaret O'Brien recalled that he was smiling. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button and help us share these forgotten chapters of history with more truth-seekers like you. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries and psychological horror rooted in real events. The next part of this story gets even more disturbing, so make sure you're ready. Let's discover what happens next in the final days before James Kirkwood's world came crashing down. November 14, 1891 began like any other morning at Thornfield Station. The sun rose at 5:17 a.m., painting the Mitchell grass country in shades of gold and crimson. Thomas Weatherby, a 23-year-old station hand who'd been with Thornfield for less than 6 months, was assigned to check the eastern paddocks and make sure the sheep had adequate access to water in the unseasonably warm weather. At approximately 6:45 a.m., Weatherby reached the edge of Hangman's Gorge, a natural ravine that cut through the property for nearly 3 miles. The name was local folklore. Supposedly a bushranger had been hanged from a coolabah tree near the gorge in the 1870s, though no one could confirm the story. The ravine was typically avoided by livestock due to its steep walls and treacherous footing. What Weatherby saw stopped him cold. The bottom of the gorge, some 40 feet below, was completely carpeted with sheep. Not scattered randomly as if they'd fallen, but packed together in a dense mass that filled the entire width of the ravine for approximately 400 yards. Weatherby's initial estimate of the number was conservative. He guessed perhaps 200 animals had somehow ended up in the gorge. The actual count would prove much higher. From his vantage point, Weatherby could see that most of the sheep were clearly dead. The ones at the bottom of the pile had been crushed or suffocated by the weight of those that fell after them. But what froze the blood in his veins was the realization that some were still alive, still struggling weakly in the nightmare trap they'd been driven into. Their bleeding created a sound he would later describe as like the damned crying out from hell itself. Standing at the gorge's edge, perfectly still and silent, was Banjo. The Kelpie's red and tan coat was matted with dust and blood. His flanks heaved with exertion and foam dripped from his muzzle. But his eyes, Weatherby would emphasize this detail repeatedly in later testimony, his eyes were focused and alert, fixed on the mass of dying sheep below with what looked disturbingly like satisfaction. Weatherby shouted at the dog, more from shock than any expectation of response. Banjo turned his head slowly to look at the station hand, held his gaze for several seconds, then turned and loped away toward the station buildings with the easy, ground-covering gait of a working dog at the end of a long task. It took Weatherby 20 minutes to ride back to the station and raise the alarm. By 7:15 a.m., Edward Thornfield, Overseer Robert Hennessy, and 6 station hands were galloping toward Hangman's Gorge. What they found exceeded Weatherby's initial report in both scale and horror. The final count would establish that 1,043 sheep had been driven into the gorge. The operation would have required exceptional skill and stamina, moving that many animals across several miles of rough country, controlling them with sufficient precision to drive them over the edge in organized groups rather than allowing them to scatter and escape. For a single dog working alone, it should have been impossible. But the evidence was undeniable. Dog tracks covered the area around the gorge's rim, showing where Banjo had worked the mob, bringing groups of 50 to 100 sheep to the edge and driving them over with calculated, methodical precision. The killing had taken hours. Thornfield's stockman estimated that Banjo had begun his work sometime around midnight and continued until dawn. The sheep at the bottom had died quickly, crushed by those falling after them. The ones near the top of the pile had survived longer, packed so tightly they couldn't move, suffocating slowly as the weight above them increased. Some had actually climbed onto the backs of their dying flock mates in desperate attempts to escape, only to find themselves equally trapped. The gorge's walls were too steep and smooth for the sheep to climb, creating a perfect natural killing floor. Edward Thornfield, a man who'd spent his entire life in the pastoral industry and witnessed every manner of livestock death, reportedly vomited at the scene. His overseer, Robert Hennessy, immediately asked the question that was on everyone's mind: where's Kirkwood? The search for James Kirkwood lasted less than 15 minutes. Station hand Michael O'Grady found him in the equipment shed, approximately 100 yards from the main station buildings. The shed was a simple structure: corrugated iron roof, rough timber walls, dirt floor. It housed saddles, bridles, tools, and the various equipment necessary for station work. Kirkwood hung from one of the roof beams. He'd used a standard hangman's noose, professionally tied with 13 coils, a detail that would later strike investigators as significant, given that most suicide victims who choose hanging employ crude, slipknot arrangements rather than the complex traditional noose Kirkwood had constructed. The rope was a standard 3/4-inch hemp line commonly used for leaden. G. Horses, Dr. Malcolm Fraser, who served as the nearest medical authority in Longreach and was summoned to examine the body, estimated time of death at approximately 5:30 a.m., roughly 90 minutes before Weatherby discovered the massacre at Hangman's Gorge. Kirkwood's body showed the classic signs of death by hanging: petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes, lividity in the lower extremities, distinctive ligature marks on the neck corresponding to the rope's position. But certain details troubled Dr. Fraser immediately. First, Kirkwood's hands were positioned oddly, not clutching at the rope as would be expected from someone experiencing the natural panic of strangulation, but hanging loosely at his sides as if he'd accepted his death with complete calm. Second, there were no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture or disturbed earth beneath his feet to suggest the desperate final moments typical of hanging deaths. Most significantly, Kirkwood's face wore an expression that Dr. Fraser, in his formal report to the police magistrate, described as one of profound satisfaction, as though the deceased had accomplished something of great personal importance mere moments before his death. The shed's interior revealed one final chilling detail. On the dirt floor, directly beneath Kirkwood's suspended body, someone had drawn an elaborate pattern using what appeared to be sheep's blood. The design consisted of interlocking circles and geometric shapes that formed no recognizable symbol but suggested careful, deliberate construction. At the pattern's center, a single word had been written in Kirkwood's distinctive hand: understood. And sitting just outside the shed's open door, his muzzle still flecked with blood and foam, his eyes fixed on his dead master's face with an expression witnesses would later struggle to describe, was Banjo. The dog made no sound. He simply sat and watched, perfectly still, as the station hands cut down James Kirkwood's body and carried it away. The investigation into the events of November 14, 1891, began within hours of the discoveries at Hangman's Gorge and the equipment shed. Sergeant William Morrison of the Queensland Police Force rode out from Longreach with Constable David Chen, reaching Thornfield Station by early afternoon. What they encountered challenged every assumption they held about the relationship between working dogs and their masters. Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the force who'd investigated murders, livestock theft, and various frontier crimes, admitted in his official report that he'd never witnessed anything comparable. The scale of the sheep massacre alone was unprecedented in Queensland's pastoral history. That it had been accomplished by a single dog working without human supervision defied rational explanation. The initial theory was straightforward. Kirkwood had spent the night driving his own sheep into the gorge, then hanged himself in a fit of madness or despair. The dog had simply accompanied him, perhaps trying to please its master by helping with what it perceived as normal herding work. This theory collapsed within 48 hours. First, the timeline didn't support it. Dr. Fraser's examination had established Kirkwood's time of death at approximately 5:30 a.m., but the evidence at Hangman's Gorge indicated the massacre had begun around midnight and continued until at least 6:30 a.m., an hour after Kirkwood's death. The kill site was 2 miles from the equipment shed where Kirkwood died. Even allowing for uncertainty in the time of death estimate, there was no plausible scenario in which Kirkwood had participated directly in driving the sheep to their deaths. Second, witnesses came forward with troubling testimony. Night watchman Arthur Graves reported seeing Banjo leave the station compound alone around 11:45 p.m. on November 13th. Graves had assumed the dog was simply relieving himself and would return quickly. Instead, Banjo had disappeared into the darkness for hours. Graves had been on the verge of raising an alarm when the dog returned at approximately 6:35 a.m., appearing exhausted and blood-streaked. This meant Banjo had been at Hangman's Gorge, driving sheep to their deaths, while Kirkwood was already hanging dead in the equipment shed. Sergeant Morrison interviewed every person at Thornfield Station, compiling accounts that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of the relationship between drover and dog in the weeks before the incident. Margaret O'Brien's testimony about Kirkwood's one-sided conversations with Banjo took on new significance. Station hands recalled instances of the dog displaying unusual behavior, working sheep without commands, organizing livestock in strange patterns, seeming to anticipate Kirkwood's wishes before they were expressed. William McAllister provided perhaps the most unsettling detail. He recalled a conversation from early November in which Kirkwood had said, "When a dog works sheep long enough, it stops seeing them as animals and starts seeing them as units to be moved. And once you understand they're just units, just obstacles to be organized or eliminated, you can make them do anything. You can make them destroy themselves." At the time, McAllister had assumed Kirkwood was discussing normal droving philosophy. In retrospect, the statement seemed to carry darker implications. The question of what to do with Banjo created immediate controversy. Edward Thornfield wanted the dog destroyed immediately, arguing that any animal capable of such organized killing posed an unacceptable danger to livestock and potentially to humans. But Sergeant Morrison hesitated, noting that the KELPIE had shown no aggression toward people and had, after all, only done what it had been bred and trained to do, move sheep with ruthless efficiency. The decision was complicated by the dog's value. Banjo was, by all accounts, an exceptional working animal worth significant money. Several station owners expressed interest in acquiring him, arguing that with proper retraining and supervision, the dog could return to normal stock work. The Queensland Sheepdog Association sent a representative to evaluate the animal, hoping to preserve Banjo's bloodline if nothing else. Dr. Edmund Hartley, a veterinary surgeon from Brisbane with an interest in animal behavior, traveled to Thornfield Station to examine Banjo. His report, preserved in the Queensland State Archives, reads like a study in professional bafflement. The subject is a male KELPIE of approximately 4 years, in excellent physical condition despite evident exhaustion from recent exertion. Standard behavioral tests indicate normal responses to commands and environmental stimuli. The dog displays no signs of rabies, distemper, or other diseases that might explain aberrant behavior. However, I must note an unsettling quality in the animal's demeanor. When presented with a small flock of sheep in controlled conditions, the dog exhibited perfect technical ability but absolute absence of what I would term natural enthusiasm. The animal performed its work with mechanical precision, showing neither the joy typical of working dogs nor the stress common in improperly trained animals. It was, in the most disturbing sense, completely emotionless, as though herding had become not an instinct but a cold intellectual exercise. Dr. Hartley recommended the dog be destroyed, not due to immediate danger, but because I cannot in good conscience certify that an animal demonstrating such fundamentally altered psychological characteristics poses no threat to future livestock or human safety. The inquest into James Kirkwood's death convened on November 28, 1891, in Longreach. Police Magistrate Herbert Wilkins presided over 3 days of testimony from station workers, police investigators, and medical experts. The proceedings were well attended, drawing spectators from across western Queensland who'd heard sensational accounts of the sheep massacre and the drover's mysterious death. The evidence presented created a portrait of a man who had become progressively obsessed with testing the limits of canine intelligence and obedience. Witness after witness described Kirkwood's increasingly bizarre behavior in the months before his death. The long, one-sided conversations with Banjo, the strange patterns he'd forced the dog to create with sheep, the incidents of seemingly purposeless livestock destruction. Dr. Fraser testified about the peculiarities of Kirkwood's suicide, the professional hangman's noose, the absence of struggle, the satisfied expression frozen on the drover's face. He noted the blood pattern on the shed floor and the single word, understood, without offering any interpretation of its meaning. The most compelling testimony came from Margaret O'Brien, who recounted the last conversation she'd overheard between Kirkwood and Edward Thornfield. Her description of Kirkwood's statement about teaching him to think beyond instinct and understanding the difference between us took on sinister significance when combined with the evidence of what Banjo had accomplished alone after his master's death. Magistrate Wilkins struggled to construct a coherent narrative from the evidence. His final ruling, issued on December 1, 1891, was a masterpiece of official equivocation. This court finds that James Kirkwood did willfully take his own life on the morning of November 14, 1891, while suffering from a temporary derangement of mind brought about by isolation, heat, and the general stress affecting workers in the pastoral industry during this period of industrial unrest. The court cannot definitively establish Mr. Kirkwood's precise role, if any, in the destruction of livestock at Hangman's Gorge, though we note with grave concern the evidence suggesting the deceased had been conducting what can only be described as behavioral experiments upon his working dog in the months prior to his death. We recommend that the animal in question be destroyed, and that station owners throughout Queensland be made aware of the potential dangers of allowing working dogs to operate without proper human supervision. The ruling satisfied no one. Station workers who'd witnessed Kirkwood's progressive descent into obsession felt the judgment didn't adequately address the drover's deliberate training program and its horrifying culmination. Animal welfare advocates argued the court was scapegoating an innocent dog for the actions of a disturbed man. The Queensland Pastoralists Association worried the case would be used by union organizers to paint station owners as cruel taskmasters who drove workers to madness. Banjo was destroyed on December 3, 1891, by rifle shot. Edward Thornfield performed the execution himself, wanting to ensure the job was done properly. According to witnesses, the dog showed no fear or resistance. It simply stood calmly, watching Thornfield with those unsettling, intelligent eyes until the moment the rifle fired. The bloodline was not preserved. Dr. Hartley's recommendation ensured that no breeding program would continue Banjo's genetics. The Gleason Kennels in Victoria, which had produced the dog, issued a statement distancing themselves from the incident and emphasizing that Banjo's behavior was the result of improper training, not any fault in the breeding line. James Kirkwood was buried in an unmarked grave in the Longreach Cemetery. His family, if he had any, never came forward to claim the body or his few possessions. Edward Thornfield paid for the burial out of his own pocket, wanting to resolve the matter with minimal attention. But the story refused to die quietly. Within weeks, garbled versions of the events at Thornfield Station were circulating throughout Queensland and beyond. Newspapers in Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne ran sensationalized accounts with headlines like, "Demon Dog Kills 1,000 Sheep and Drover's Suicide," packed with killer KELPIE. The Queensland Sheepdog Association received dozens of letters from worried owners asking if their working dogs might be capable of similar behavior. Several copycat incidents followed in early 1892. In March, a drover near Charleville reported that his KELPIE had driven a mob of 300 sheep into a waterhole, drowning approximately 70 animals before being stopped. In June, a station hand in New South Wales found his entire flock of 400 sheep organized in a perfect spiral pattern in an empty paddock, a formation that served no practical purpose and seemed designed purely to demonstrate the organizing dog's control. None of these incidents matched the scale or apparent premeditation of the Thornfield massacre, but they generated enough concern that the Queensland government commissioned a study on working dog training methods and potential psychological dangers. The resulting report, published in late 1892, recommended stricter oversight of drovers and mandatory rest periods to prevent the kind of isolation-induced obsession that had apparently affected Kirkwood. The most lasting impact, however, was on the collective psyche of Queensland's pastoral workers. The Thornfield incident became a cautionary tale told around campfires and in shearers' quarters, a reminder that the bond between man and working dog, pushed too far or twisted by obsession, could become something monstrous. The events at Thornfield Station in November 1891 reverberated through Australian society in ways that extended far beyond the pastoral industry. What began as a local tragedy evolved into a broader conversation about the psychological effects of frontier life, the ethics of animal training, and the dark potential of human obsession. The Queensland Pastoral Industry Reform Act of 1893 can be traced directly to the Thornfield incident. The legislation mandated minimum staffing levels at large stations, required regular medical and psychological evaluations for workers spending extended periods in isolation, and established guidelines for the training and supervision of working dogs. While primarily intended to prevent industrial accidents and improve worker conditions during the ongoing labor disputes, the Act's provisions about animal oversight were explicitly written in response to what had happened with James Kirkwood and Banjo. The psychological dimensions of the case attracted attention from emerging fields of study. Dr. William Rivers, a pioneering psychologist who would later become famous for his work treating shell-shocked soldiers during World War I, wrote extensively about the Thornfield case in his 1897 treatise Instinct and Intelligence, a study of mental processes in men and animals. Rivers argued that Kirkwood had suffered from what we would now recognize as a severe obsessive-compulsive disorder, focused on achieving absolute control over another creature's will. The tragedy at Thornfield Station, Rivers wrote, illustrates the danger inherent in the human desire for dominion over nature. Mr. Kirkwood was not content with the traditional relationship between drover and dog, one of cooperation and mutual benefit. Instead, he sought to break down the barrier between human intellect and animal instinct, to create a creature that thought like a man but obeyed like a beast. The result was neither human nor animal, but something far more disturbing. A living tool capable of understanding the meaning of its actions but lacking the moral framework to reject unconscionable commands. The case also influenced early veterinary psychology. Dr. Edmund Hartley, who had examined Banjo before the dog's destruction, spent the remainder of his career studying the psychological effects of intensive training on working animals. His 1903 book, The Limits of Obedience, used the Thornfield incident as a central case study, arguing that animals subjected to extreme training regimens could develop psychological abnormalities analogous to human mental illness. We must ask ourselves, Hartley wrote, at what point does training become abuse? When does the development of a skill become the destruction of an animal's natural psychological balance? Banjo the Kelpie was, by all technical measures, the perfect working dog. He could accomplish tasks that should have been impossible for a single animal. But this perfection came at a cost, the complete elimination of normal canine emotional responses, leaving a creature that functioned with mechanical efficiency but no joy, no fear, no natural resistance to performing actions that would disturb even the most hardened stock handler. The Thornfield case appeared in multiple academic contexts over the following decades. Criminologists cited it as an example of murder by proxy, a controversial classification since neither Kirkwood nor his dog had killed humans. But the incident shared characteristics with cases where individuals used intermediaries to commit violent acts while maintaining psychological distance from the actual killing. Animal rights advocates, then a nascent movement primarily concerned with the treatment of urban pets rather than working animals, seized on the Thornfield incident as evidence of broader exploitation in the pastoral industry. Pamphlets and articles appeared arguing that the intensive training of working dogs constituted a form of psychological torture, transforming natural animals into damaged tools of human enterprise. The pastoral industry pushed back against these characterizations, arguing that proper working dog training enhanced rather than damaged the animals' lives, giving them purpose and mental stimulation. But the Thornfield case forced even the most traditional station owners to examine their practices and consider whether certain training methods crossed ethical boundaries. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact was on Australian cultural mythology. The figure of the drover and his loyal dog was and remains central to national identity. romanticized in poetry, song, and folk tales as a symbol of mateship, resilience, and the conquest of harsh country. The Thornfield incident introduced a darker counter-narrative, the isolated man whose relationship with his dog becomes not partnership, but pathology, whose mastery of his craft transforms into dangerous obsession. Henry Lawson, one of Australia's most celebrated poets and a contemporary of the Thornfield events, never wrote directly about the incident, but scholars have noted echoes of it in his later work. His 1896 poem The Drover's Dog contains lines that read differently when considered in light of what happened at Thornfield Station. He trained that dog with cruel hand to work the sheep, to guard the land, but something broke within the beast when master's kindness long since ceased. The story spread beyond Australia. British and American newspapers covered the incident, often with significant embellishment. An 1893 article in the San Francisco Chronicle claimed Kirkwood had been conducting diabolical experiments in animal mesmerism, and that Banjo had been hypnotized into becoming a four-legged killing machine. These sensationalized accounts bore little resemblance to the facts but kept the story alive in popular consciousness. The Thornfield incident also appeared in early fiction dealing with human-animal relationships. Jack London's 1906 novel White Fang contains a subplot about a dog driven to madness by cruel training that many critics believe was influenced by garbled accounts of the Kirkwood case. Similarly, elements of the story can be detected in later works exploring the psychological boundaries between human and animal consciousness. Academic interest in the case continued through the 20th century. A 1967 study by behavioral psychologist Dr. Margaret Crawford examined historical records of the Thornfield incident, alongside modern understanding of animal training, NG, and cognitive development. Crawford argued that Kirkwood had inadvertently created what she termed learned helplessness with inverted agency, a condition where the dog had been trained so thoroughly to respond to human commands that it lost the ability to resist even psychologically harmful instructions, while simultaneously developing an abnormal capacity for independent action in the absence of direct supervision. What makes the Thornfield case so disturbing, Crawford wrote, is not that a dog killed sheep. Dogs have predatory instincts, and working dogs regularly engage in controlled forms of aggressive behavior toward livestock. The horror lies in the evidence that Banjo understood the meaning and consequences of his actions, but had been conditioned to suppress any natural resistance to performing them. The dog had become, in essence, a conscious participant in mass killing, while lacking the moral capacity to refuse. The site of the massacre itself became a minor landmark of the macabre. Hangman's Gorge attracted curiosity seekers for several years after the incident, forcing Edward Thornfield to post guards and eventually fence off the area to prevent trespassing. Local Aboriginal peoples, according to oral histories collected in the 1970s, considered the gorge cursed and avoided it for decades afterward. Thornfield Station itself survived the scandal and continued operating until 1923, when it was subdivided and sold. The equipment shed where Kirkwood hanged himself was torn down in 1895, after several station hands refused to enter it, reporting feelings of profound unease and claiming to hear phantom sounds of a dog whining in the darkness. The legacy of November 14, 1891, ultimately rests in the questions the incident raised, questions that remain unsettled even today. How much of what happened was the result of Kirkwood's deliberate training, and how much was spontaneous behavior from a dog that had somehow learned to think beyond its instincts? Did Banjo understand that driving sheep into the gorge would kill them, or was he simply executing a complex herding pattern without comprehending the fatal consequences? Most troubling, did Kirkwood die knowing what his dog would do in his absence, or was the massacre an unintended consequence of training methods that had gone catastrophically wrong? These questions matter because they touch on fundamental issues of animal consciousness, training ethics, and the psychological effects of isolation and obsession. The Thornfield incident provides no comfortable answers, only the stark reality of 1,000 dead sheep, a hanged drover, and a dog that had to be destroyed because no one could determine whether it was a victim of its master's madness or an accomplice to coordinated mass killing. What do you think drove James Kirkwood to push his dog beyond the boundaries of normal training into something far darker? Was he a disturbed individual conducting cruel experiments, or a skilled drover who accidentally created something he couldn't control? And what about Banjo? Was he simply following training taken to a horrifying extreme, or had he developed a genuine understanding of his actions that made him something more than a working dog, and something less than innocent? Leave your theories in the comments below. This community has some of the most insightful perspectives on historical mysteries, and I'm genuinely curious what you think was happening at Thornfield Station in those final weeks before the massacre. If you found this deep dive into one of Australia's darkest pastoral tragedies compelling, subscribe to the Fear Abbey for more lost chapters of history that challenge everything we think we know about the past. These aren't the sanitized stories from textbooks. These are the real events that people tried to forget but that demand to be remembered. Next week, we're examining another case of obsession and death on the frontier, the 1897 Dakota Territory incident, where a homesteader and his entire family vanished, leaving behind only a house full of intricate rope knots and a journal filled with mathematical calculations about the nature of consciousness. Until then, remember, history's darkest truths are found not in the grand narratives of kings and battles, but in the forgotten corners where ordinary people encountered extraordinary darkness. See you in the next video.